So thanks very much. It's an enormous privilege to have been asked to read Msgr Nusca's book initially, and an honor to be able to respond to it now. Normally, a good book response has three parts. You praise the book, you summarize the book, and then you give the book you would have written if you had had the chance to. I'll do some praise. I'm going to skip the summary because you've already had the author give a wonderful summary. And my remarks on the third one, I hope, is not a replacement, but actually a pertinent engagement with one aspect of it. But for praise, if you haven't read the book, obviously you're already, I hope, excited to do so because it really merits praise in abundance. It's small. It is aimed at a level of writing and explication that's meant to be accessible to non-scholars, that is to say the faithful of the church as a whole. And it also seeks to provide a sort of coherent vision of what is, surely we know, one of the most complex and bewildering of the scriptural books. And in all of these things, Msgr Nusca has succeeded marvelously in its hopes, indeed exceeding its, on its own terms, modest claims. He wraps all of this stuff up together with great simplicity, modesty, but if you look at the footnotes, and you've already picked it up from his presentation, enormous learning. And it is, as he tries to present it, this book, meant to provide a very powerful sense of calling that goes to the heart of our Christian life today. I want to look at, or jump off a bit from his fifth chapter, as well as the final chapter, in which he talks about the fourth face, which he explained. That is to say, having presented the three faces of Christ, there is this imagined fourth face, which is us, in one sense, our fallen, then suffering, and then redeemed humanity, our true self as human beings, that's then revealed somehow through this imagery of the faces of Jesus that summon up the promises of our transformation. What he says is Christosis, becoming Christ, or angelification, and so on, that is given to the baptized Christian in their persistent faith. Now, I think that this fifth chapter, in which he discusses the fourth face, and he goes through then the letters to the seven churches as well at the beginning of the book of Revelation, is in a way the spiritually vibrant center of the book as a whole. In it, Msgr Nusca points out how contemporary Christians and the contemporary church are both called and equipped to live in a world that has rejected God's divine sovereignty in ordering worship. And he gave a little sense of that at the end of his presentation. The very nature of the book of Revelation's vision, this open door sense, vision to God's true ordering of the world, is that these truths that we see in the book of Revelation apply utterly to present history, to us, as much as to the past. So I quote from his own book. At the beginning of the book, we should bear in mind that the first century world of the Christians in Asia Minor is in turmoil. It is a time of crisis. It is a dangerous time, not unlike our own, in which there are wars and rumors of wars, false prophets abound, and the poor languish in the margins of society. Dominated by an empire whose symbols and values stand in stark opposition to those of the gospel, it is a world in which God is not accorded his proper place at the center of life and human relationships. Unquote. So especially, as Msgr Nusca says, in the midst of a postmodern era, such as our own, in which God is no longer at the center or even known, therefore faith, perseverance, and a clarified and articulate witness is called for along the concrete lines of the book of Revelation's story, which he has outlined. So what are those lines for us? That is the question I want us to ponder a little bit. And in this, responding to this question, what are these lines we are to follow, according to the story that is now our own, I think Msgr Nusca is clear on the one hand, but he's also very open-ended. the center of this life and witness is the cross of Jesus itself. He's very clear about that. That's the great reversal of imperial and otherwise human forms of power and self-imposition. And not only is the cross and Christian martyrial life a model or a vocation, it is, according to the book of Revelation, a given. It's a given. It's a predicted necessity in the face of human societies which have consistently and systematically rejected God. So here we come to what is, at least for me, the provocative nub of the book. That is the claim that what we are reading will come. This is us. This is where we are living. And it's a question I've been mulling over, as I know probably most of us have, with respect to what we might call Christian politics in our own day. So that's what I want to turn to. In general, I think Msgr. Nusca avoids concrete discussion of politics. Although you get a sense of some of his political concerns when he touches on aspects of a post-Christian, or as he puts it, narcissistic secular culture. And he names a number of these elements which come to the fore and ought to come to the fore of our political concern. Euthanasia, disdain for the poor, violence, and so on. The fourth face of a human vocation transformed then by the self-offered visages or faces of Christ in the history of the world will, Msgr. Nusca asserts, confront these kinds of issues with a forceful clarity. And yet I wonder what political traction this confrontation might involve. Indeed, if suffering, rather than causing suffering, is the Christian's mode of political witness, and if that witness stands against a culture as a whole, along with that culture's politics, which is what he is saying, it seems as if Christian politics is shaped by overwhelming struggles, as the imagery of the book of Revelation in fact suggests, rather than by the gradualistic transformations we associate with the ballot box and legislative deliberation. And this raises profound, and I dare say disturbing questions about the nature of God and the shape of the Christian social life. In a way, I wish, although I didn't expect, that Msgr. Nusca might have engaged these implications more directly, since I think that the book of Revelation is a challenge, perhaps even a negation, to human politics as normally constituted and imagined in our own era. So, for instance, catastrophe, which is now the category I want to take off from what we've talked about. Catastrophe has always been associated with the book of Revelation. And catastrophic thinking, particularly in political terms, has been associated more recently, as we know, and usually negatively, with fundamentalistic or dispensationalistic readings of the book of Revelation. It's part of what has given the book of Revelation a bad name in our culture. Catastrophic politics, we have been told, and not without some justification in this or that case, accounts for Christian passivity in the face of global challenges like nuclear war or climate change. But for all the worries critics of fundamentalism might have, catastrophic thinking has in fact re-entered more respectable political discourse more recently. And this in the face of two realities that I want us to consider. First, the well-publicized reality of human and natural catastrophe, like wars, obviously, disease, disasters, from Syria to AIDS to tsunamis on the one hand, and on the other, the seeming incapacity of local and global political frameworks to respond decisively and wisely to such realities, what one might call the ravages of political complexity in a world where its population has exploded from almost 500 million people in 1500, that was a world which couldn't even solve the Reformation, to over 7 billion today, an increase of over 14 times population. How do we respond to problems politically that touch everybody? Whatever the practical goals of much contemporary thinking may be about catastrophe, and people have begun to do this quite systematically in thinking about catastrophe prevention or catastrophe response. How do you deal with tsunamis? How do you deal with a new flu epidemic and so on? catastrophe is increasingly recognized simply, and I think often horrendously, simply as a form of change that happens in the face of human incapacity, political or otherwise. Indeed, in historical terms, catastrophe is one of the most common features in the history of human civil life. Some of you may be familiar with a popular book like Jared Diamond's Collapse, which was published in 2005, which popularized the idea that climate, environmental degradation, and societal conflict have had in the past and will probably continue to have in producing catastrophic effects on various communities. And he looks at various points in human history. The Anasazi civilization in southwest, what is now southwest United States, Easter Island, Haiti in the 19th century and beyond, Rwanda only 30 years ago. For somebody like Diamond, population pressures stand as the great direct and indirect foundation of the slow or sometimes sudden unraveling of whole societies and civilizations. But of course, there are other social historians who would center on things like epidemiological catastrophe, like those of the 6th century plague of Justinian, which may have opened the door to Islamic expansion, for instance, in a real way in the Eastern Mediterranean, or the AIDS pandemic. And they've pointed to these kinds of epidemics and the effects that they have had and will have as historically inevitable and always ineluctably significant. Whether natural, epidemiological, conflictual, or based on environmentally corrosive effects of human activity, catastrophe now, as many historians are recognizing, is a given in human life. And as given, the politics of catastrophe in all their unpredictable outcomes, you can think of Europe and Africa in just the last century, follow as a kind of unmanipulable set of adjustments within social chaos of one sort or another. That's the setting. Msgr Nusca's reading of Christian martyrial existence is that it too is a given, according to the book of Revelation, among other things. And that would mean that it stands, surely, as a key to Christian political witness in a historically ineluctable fashion that is permanent, not exceptional, which would make the book of Revelation a piece of daily advice, as it were, rather than guidance for unusual times, which it is usually taken as being, if one wants to think of it in these kinds of contexts. Thus, the Christian faith, for instance, makes fundamental claims about the shape of individual catastrophe, given in terms of suffering, loss, and death. And these have been defined in terms of the inevitable character of human creatureliness, let's say mortality, and however shaped by sin, human limitation and incapacity. But Christianity is also deeply concerned with social catastrophe as well, although this topic, in a way that even exceeds the modern obscuring of individual limitation and even evanescence, has been mostly muted in recent Christian discussion. Even leaving aside the catastrophe elaborated in the kinds of apocalyptic description that is so disdained by contemporary critics of fundamentalistic Christian millennialism, including that of the book of Revelation, the fact is that the scriptures as a whole represent human history in extended, variegated, and consistently catastrophic terms. From the early chapters of Genesis through the New Testament epistles, including the Gospels, peoples, nations, and of course Israel in particular, are subjected to a long line of catastrophic experience. Think about it. Floods, droughts, invasions, plagues, pests, grasshoppers, earthquakes. And at the center of the Bible itself is a kind of supreme catastrophic figure. That is to say, the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple, and the complete dismantling of Israel's political system. That the cross itself engages this figure explicitly, locates, it seems to me, catastrophe at the center of Christian theology. In such a way that apocalyptic cataclysm, when it appears in the Gospels and letters, involving the sudden destruction of large proportions of the human race, appears as the extension of a Christian theological vision rather than as a novel or extraneous perspective. And if this is so, then the developing early modern and modern line of Christian political theology, which is engaged, as it still is, in thinking about efficacious decision-making, either positively or correctively in democratic or revolutionary terms, can at best be but a secondary mode of ecclesial ethics. Because the primary mode of Christian politics would have to be aimed at living faithfully within or in the face of catastrophe, not at effectively preventing it or evading it. But I wonder, is this what you want to say? So, let me press the question just a little further. Catastrophe is often viewed as an end-time category and has in part been the basis, that's been part of the basis for critiquing its usefulness. It is seen, as it were, as a counsel of despair, as well as a perverted and ultimately lazy trust in the value of final destruction. Why bother trying to make things better, since it's all about to go up in smoke anyway? That would be the critique. But as I just noted, biblical catastrophism is not primarily about the end of all things, even if that end is also a given. Rather, catastrophism is about change that lies mostly outside of human control. Hence, catastrophe in a Christian sense is not about endings. It's all about the character of the middle that lies between beginnings and endings. The middle is, of course, characterized by a host of smaller, if often wrenching, endings, but it is middle nonetheless, and hence it's the place we're meant to live and to figure out how to live. So how do we live, for instance, as children when our parents die? How do we live when our home burns down along with everything in it? Some of us who are pastors know parishioners who have done just this, or perhaps we ourselves have been through it, as have been many and are still many who are doing so in our day. How do we live when rivers and crops dry up? How do we live when our leaders are arrested and executed, and the same fate hangs over our own labor? How do we live when children or spouse fall dreadfully ill? Catastrophe marks the character of change within everybody's mortal existence. But that existence is nonetheless the existence we are given to live. When Jesus lays out the catastrophic character of human history in something like the 13th chapter of Mark's Gospel, he lists a whole host of very familiar realities that then reappear, of course, in the book of Revelation. Being arrested, being beaten, being falsely accused, being betrayed, being put to flight, being frozen, being afflicted. These are end-time realities as we know from their popularizations, but also in the book of Revelation. But in fact, they are also part and parcel of middle-time reality, all in its own way, from family disintegration to the clear moment of witness. What Jesus says about actual life in these times, however, is very simple. Endure. That's Mark 13:13. Endure. Those who endure to the end will be saved. Msgr. Nusca points to this clarity and focus again and again. Endurance is salvation in a way. And endurance, a word that has its root in the Greek of a steady remaining in place, becomes the paradoxical key to life within this kind of catastrophic political context. One stays. One lives through that which seems to assault the ground on which one stands, and the life that one sees slipping from one's hands. The Christian politics of catastrophe, that is, the Christian politics of revelation, I would suggest, carried out in the midst of the normal politics of complex incapacity, is the politics of endurance, it appears. So my main question then, which I will leave us with, is straightforward. What does this look like from precisely the perspective of the political order we actually live in? Msgr. Nusca warns against two misunderstandings at one point in his book. First, he warns against thinking that enduring Christians are somehow passive. And second, that the violence associated with the book of Revelation's catastrophic thinking should be taken too literally, certainly as applied to God's ordering of the world, that is, the world from the standpoint of God, as he characterizes Revelation's description of reality. My intuition, however, is that the book of Revelation, read just within the contours of the world as we are watching it unravel, presents us with a social context over which we have lost political control in any normal, fundamental way. And that the book of Revelation unveils a God whose character is deeply mysterious in that context. And Msgr Nusca himself points at this in passing with some quotes from the scholars Beasley, Murray, and Caird about the ultimate mystery of this God who seems to be ordering these visions that John has. And this character is a way that ought to, divine character, unsettle common pieties about violence and nonviolence. To endure in such a world and within the providence of such a God, as we see in the book of Revelation, is something that ought well to elicit our fears, holy and faithful though they may be. So I wonder if this is the next volume of Msgr Nusca's work of anti-cultural witness, and one that will prove perhaps a yet more difficult sell, even than this present challenging, embracing work. That is to say, a book on the reality of what the tradition has called timor Dei, the fear of God, as a formational practice which ought to underlie what it means to be faithful. Thank you.
Wow.